and I'm a librarian at the Sonoma County History and Genealogy Library. Before we begin, the session will be recorded and will become available on the library's YouTube channel. Also, please mute yourself and turn your video off. Because we have such a large group tonight, we decided that questions or comments in the chat will only reach us, the hosts. So if you have any questions, we will have a 10 to 15-minute Q&A at the end of the talk. So please submit your questions through the chat later. I'd also like to mention that my colleague, Joanna Kolosov, is here behind the scenes to help with the technology. Tonight's presentation covers a subject matter that researchers and historians have neglected for far too long. And we were very excited when Professor Smith not only agreed to join us tonight, but also suggested to include and highlight specific cases of unfree workers here in Sonoma County. On this note, we now invite everyone to take a moment to honor these ancestral lands that we are collectively gathered upon, and encourage all of us to think of ways to become better stewards of the lands we inhabit. We acknowledge our libraries occupy the traditional homelands of the Coast Miwok, Kashaya, Southern Pomo, and Wapo tribal nations, whose descendants still live here today. We recognize the historical and ongoing violence of settler colonialism and affirm indigenous sovereignty. We will continue to hold ourselves accountable to the needs of the indigenous people of Sonoma County, California, and beyond. Our presenter tonight, Stacey L. Smith, is an associate professor of history at Oregon State University. She specializes in the history of the American West and the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. She's also the author of Freedom's Frontier, California and the Struggle Over Unfree Labor, Emancipation, and Reconstruction. And I'm going to let you take it from here, Stacey, and stop sharing my screen.
All righty, so thank you so much, Simone. Let me go ahead and bring my slideshow up. And here we go. Okay. So I wanted to really kind of thank you all for coming out tonight, or you didn't come out of your homes, but to coming online tonight to hear my presentation. I also really want to thank Simone and Joanna at the library for hosting me, for managing all of this. I am really excited that there are so many people here, and it's a great opportunity to talk about some California history that may not be all that familiar to some of you. It may be very familiar to some, but generally I find that not a lot of Californians or Americans in general kind of know this history that I'm about to talk about. So I'm actually going to start with a little story from my research about this fellow. This is Oliver Wozencraft. The picture here of him is from about the 1860s. And in 1856, Oliver Wozencraft, who was a physician and also a politician, he was actually at the California Constitutional Convention in 1849. In 1856, he complained to police that his slave, a 9-year-old girl named Shasta, had disappeared from his home. He and his family suspected that the local free Black community was hiding the child, which was really kind of a common practice in fugitive slave cases. And they had allegedly changed her name, cut her hair, dressed her as a boy in order to keep her hidden from him. Now, later, using a hired detective and getting the police involved, Wozencraft was able to track Shasta down and found her in the home of a free Black woman, and the woman's name was Charlotte Gomez. Police helped Wozencraft seize the child away from Gomez, and then he filed criminal charges against Gomez for kidnapping. The local Black community defended Charlotte Gomez in the press and hailed her as a hero for rescuing this enslaved child. But still, Shasta went back to Oliver Wozencraft's family in the end and ended up staying with them as a household servant for most of the remainder of her life. Now, you may notice that I didn't tell you, I told you when this happened, which was 1856, but I didn't tell you where it happened. You may have been able to guess, but the big surprise here is that it happened in San Francisco. So it happened in San Francisco in 1856, this fugitive slave case. So already this should cause us a little bit of confusion and head scratching. Why is there slavery in California in 1856 when California was supposed to be a free state? And then I have another surprise for you, though, which is that Shasta was not an African-American child. She was, in fact, an enslaved Native American child. And as far as we know, she was a member of the Yuki Nation, whose homeland is in what is now Mendocino County. Now, Oliver Wozencraft had gotten a hold of Shasta because he was a special commissioner who was appointed to make treaties with Native nations in Northern California in 1851. And so here we have this one of the earliest photographs from California in general, and one of the very earliest photographs of Native peoples of California. And here is Wozencraft seated in the center. He's meeting with a group of Maidu headmen, chiefs here. And it was during this trip into Northern California that Wozencraft and his entourage ended up clashing with a band of Yuki people. And he claimed that the Yuki abandoned Shasta, who was a toddler, when they fled. So Wozencraft then took possession of the child and later made his control over her formal. He went to the courts, and the California legislature had passed a law in 1850 called the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians. And the law allowed white people to acquire Native children who were orphaned or given up by their families, and then to claim guardianship over them until they reached adulthood. The California state legislature eventually expanded this law in 1860 to allow for the formal indenture of Native children, so not just guardianship, but actually a formal process of indenture of Native children until they reached their 20s. It kind of depended on what age they were when they were indentured, how long they would have to serve. And also this 1860 law allowed for the indenture of Native adults captured in war, and to hold Native adults, adult men and women, for up to 10 years. Now, we don't know whether Wozencraft and his family took advantage of the expanded Act for the Government and Protection of Indians from 1860 to kind of keep control of Shasta. But we do know that regardless of her legal standing and whether or not they use the law to bind her into their household, she stayed with their household, stayed with the Wozencraft family as a domestic servant until at least the early 1880s. And so this is a photograph. That's actually Shasta there is in the middle with members of the Wozencraft family. And this photograph is probably from the 1880s, although it was published in 1937. Oh yeah, 1882 is the date on it. So this is all a surprising story. Right? We're hearing about slavery in California. We're seeing slavery in a place that we don't expect it to be. And it's also involving maybe people we don't expect to hear about when we talk about the history of slavery in the United States, Native Americans. And that's kind of the whole point of my book that Simone told you a little bit about. which came out in 2013, and really kind of the point of the talk today. So let me just sort of share some of the things I'm going to talk about for, or an outline of some of the things I'm going to talk about for the rest of today. The Shasta story is really just kind of an entree into thinking about how California and maybe kind of the American West more broadly change our understanding of things we think we already know about: slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. Right? So what is going on in California? How is that different than elsewhere? How might it really kind of complicate and change how we think about some of the most important issues and crises of the United States? So one of the things that we'll start with is really that the story of what happens in California unsettles what I will call the North-South binary. And by binary, just mean like dichotomy, right? Whenever we tell the story of slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction, we almost always organize it around the idea that this is a struggle between two regions, the North and the South. And we rarely think about the West as having much to do with that struggle. Okay. Something also that I think is evident in the story of Shasta and Oliver Wozencraft is that what's going on in California unsettles the idea that there was a sharp dichotomy, a sharp divide, a sharp binary between freedom and slavery in the United States. We see in California systems of labor, what I call unfree labor, that don't fit neatly into either freedom outright or slavery outright, but exist in this kind of gray area between outright freedom and chattel slavery, right? Being bought and sold and having your slave status inherited by your children. So California complicates that story as well. It also, of course, kind of going hand in hand with my second point, the history of California in the Gold Rush era unsettles the Black-white racial binary. Again, we tend to think of slavery, Civil War, Reconstruction as revolving around African-American civil rights, African-American slavery. And while that is the case in California as well, we see lots of different groups of people who are enslaved, who are trying to protest their enslavement, and who end up in a variety of different relationships after the end of slavery in the United States. And then the very last one I'm not going to talk a ton about, but I'm going to end with, is how thinking about California can unsettle what I call the story of abolition and emancipation, because Shasta's story tells us that the end of slavery in the United States, which was supposed to have happened in 1865 with the 13th Amendment, and was already in motion with Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation from 1863. We're always told that that's the end of slavery in the United States, but it's pretty clear from Shasta's story, at least, that something is still going on there, that there are still people being held in conditions, if not absolutely exactly slavery, in slavery-like conditions long beyond the end of emancipation. So I'm going to start by really talking about how we might unsettle that North-South binary. Let me take a swig of water here for just a second. So, as I've already said, right, when we tend to think about the Civil War and Reconstruction, this is the map that we have in our minds, right? We think of this as really a clash between the northern states and the southern states, the United States and the Confederacy. We don't really think of the West as having much to do with this story. But what I propose is that we take a look at California and kind of think about what's going on in the far West. Think about the ways in which some of the conflicts, labor systems, race relations that are prevalent in the East are actually being replicated out on the West Coast and also becoming perhaps more complicated. So what I'm trying to do here is really show us that the Civil War and Reconstruction and slavery itself were processes that included the entire nation, and we can't kind of fully understand the Civil War if we just keep focused on the North and the South. We have to look west. Now, this would have seemed a weird proposition for a lot, or it probably does to some folks still. The California Constitution of 1849, many of you probably know, banned slavery and involuntary servitude. So we might say to ourselves, well, we know that California had this 1849 anti-slavery constitution. We know California entered the United States as a free state. If you remember your US history, you probably even remember that that happened as part of the Compromise of 1850, this important political negotiation by which California was admitted as a free state, essentially to kind of counterbalance Texas, which had already been admitted as a slave state a few years before. So we may be thinking to ourselves, but California's abolished slavery. How could this be relevant? We might also, again, if we're thinking about older scholarship on slavery in the West, we might have also heard for years, and I think this was even in my textbooks when I was growing up, that there were natural limits, so-called natural limits on slavery's westward expansion. And by that, for many generations, scholars had argued that really the issue of slavery in the West was a non-issue politically, because cotton agriculture, the big plantations of the American South, couldn't expand west because of climate limitations. Essentially, that by the time you get to about central Texas, cotton plantations and slavery, plantation slavery, are just not going to work because the climate is too arid and too dry. And that basically stops slavery from going west. Now, that is true if we're thinking about sort of stereotypical Southern agriculture, right? Cotton plantations, but this isn't just what slavery is, right? Enslaved people were employed, forcibly employed in many, many different types of occupations in many different industries. And so to say that, well, it can't go west because cotton agriculture can't be profitable in the West without, of course, today's large-scale irrigation, is really to ignore the fact that slavery was a very diverse and frankly versatile, flexible institution, that slaveholders were able to find ways to employ enslaved people, again, forcibly, in a bunch of different capacities. And so that's exactly what happens in California, right? Slavery can go west because it is a flexible institution that enslavers can adapt to meet their economic needs and to make a profit off of the labor of the people who they own. And it's also possible because California actually politically and legally creates kind of a loophole for this to happen. It's not actually a loophole, really. It's just a law. The California legislature in 1852 passed its own Fugitive Slave Act. It is one of the only free states, perhaps the only free state at all, to do this. And California essentially said in 1852 that enslaved people who had been brought to California before California became a free state in September of 1850 could be taken back and enslaved in the states that they had come from. So if you were an enslaver who brought people with you, enslaved from slave states, and brought them to California during really the kind of the height of the gold rush in 49-50, then you could keep those people enslaved and take them back with you. and you had a year to do that. And if that person resisted, the state of California would help you hunt that person down, arrest them. You just had to say that you owned the person. You didn't have to offer that much proof. And then you could detain the person and leave with them and re-enslave them or keep them enslaved, right? Whatever the situation was. So California passed this because there were a lot of pro-slavery Southerners in California's early population. Roughly a third of the population of California's US-born population was from the American South. And a lot of the legislators and early judges were Southerners, and they really wanted to make it easy to keep people enslaved and allow enslavers from the South to take people back to slavery. So this law was supposed to expire in a year, right? The idea here was like, well, we're going to get around the Constitution by saying like, it's just going to be short. You just have a year to do it. But then these pro-slavery guys kept pushing and ended up extending this for 3 years until 1855, when it finally expired. So actually, even though California is a free state, there are two things that allow slavery to go west. The first, again, is the flexibility and adaptability of the institution. And second, we have this law that allows people who want to bring slaves into California to kind of evade the Constitution. Okay. So this is the kind of the setup for understanding what's going on. And so what are enslaved people doing? Well, again, if we emphasize the adaptability of enslaved people's labor, mining. Now, this may seem odd to some folks because this is the picture of mining that we have in our heads, right? That mining was this really solitary venture. We think of these rugged prospectors going out, and maybe they're working in small groups as this man is doing here. But we think of this as a very individualistic kind of economic opportunity, and it doesn't really seem like something that would be adaptable to slave labor. But in fact, we find that very large numbers, well, not very large numbers, but most enslaved people who were taken to California did work in mining. So I've gone through the census for 1850, 1852, and found like, yeah, the vast majority of enslaved people who had an occupation listed, and not all of them did, were working in mining. So we see already that enslavers are adapting this institution to what's, basically the major economic activity in California. And a lot of the people who are doing this are actually people who had been deploying enslaved people as miners in the South already. We kind of forget that there were a bunch of gold rushes in the American South in the 1820s and 1830s. And there was one in North Carolina. And I was actually able to track a group, actually several families from Western North Carolina, where there were some gold rushes in the 1830s, and tracked them to California, and they brought large numbers, roughly about 25 enslaved people with them altogether into California in the gold rush and worked them in the mines. So we actually see slaveholders, again, adapting slavery to the economic circumstances in California. And it also reminds us of the diversity of slavery in the in the Eastern United States. It's not just cotton agriculture. And just to kind of give you some more evidence, this is another very early California image. You see it all over the place, so many of you have probably seen it before, of an interracial group of miners working in Auburn Ravine, 1852. And we don't know the identities of the men pictured here. it is very much possible, especially from where this is taking place and what we know from the census records, that this is a group of masters and slaves, right? Enslaved people working at the behest of slaveholders. We don't know, but given the fact that there are very few kind of interracial parties involving free African American men in this period, it's likely that that is what's happening here, but we don't know for certain. Also, just to kind of remind us too that one of the key things that enslaved people did was domestic labor, right? Household labor and personal service work, we might think of. And so lots of enslaved people were hired out also, especially in urban areas, in places like St. Louis, Missouri, for instance. It was very common for urban slaveholders, if they had enslaved people that they didn't really have a use for in their own households, to essentially rent them out to other urban dwellers, especially those who didn't own slaves, and have them work in a domestic setting. So this was another way to make slavery profitable outside of plantation agriculture. And we see precisely the same thing happening in California as well. So this is a really fascinating advertisement from April 1850 in Sacramento. We have a man advertising that he has a black woman who's 18 years old, and that she's a good washer, ironer, and cook. And it says that she's indentured for 2 years. And probably what he's done there is said to this woman that you can, I'm going to sell you to someone, and then you're going to have to work for them for 2 years, and then you'll be set free. So we see this again. This is April of 1850. California has an anti-slavery constitution, hasn't quite entered the Union as a free state yet. So we see that really there are all kinds of different ways in which slavery is manifesting itself in these Western states, and specifically here in California. Now, one last piece of information. So this is where Simone was saying I was going to try to sort of tie things to Sonoma County history, which I want to, just as a disclaimer, I am not an expert in at all. But I promised I would sort of show some interesting pieces that would connect Sonoma County's history to this. One very interesting piece of information, actually, that didn't make it into my book, I think I didn't discover this until I was doing research for a more recent book, is that Sonoma County in 1857 reported a Black population of 72 residents, and that 27 of those 72 residents were engaged in farming. And then there's this startling fact that 26 of those 27 people were claimed as slaves by their employers, who brought them from the South. Okay, so there are a few things that should be striking here. One is 1857. The fugitive slave law, California's fugitive slave law, was a dead letter at this point. So 2 years after that, we still are finding enslaved people in Sonoma County in pretty large numbers. And this may seem like an exaggeration, but I have actually gone through the Sonoma County census, again, for this newer project, and found I counted an identical or almost identical number of enslaved people, or people I suspected were enslaved, in Sonoma County in the 1860 census. So even later than this, I was finding this in the census itself. And these are statistics reported by African Americans, free African Americans in Sonoma County, who are essentially taking a census of how many Black people are there in Sonoma County? And they're reporting this to a colored citizens convention, as they were called, like a political convention meant to basically sort of see how many Black Americans there are in each county, what their status was and all of this. And this is the surprising fact that they bring out. And again, it is borne out in the US Census for 1860. So I've got some kind of fascinating clips that I just took from the census today, just to show you how this plays out. This is for Sonoma City. I'm not entirely sure if that, like which district we're talking about, because there's also Sonoma Township is also a separate listing as well. But these are just a few screenshots here, right? And we can see that there is a man named Jacob Graham, who's 16 years old. He's the B stands for him being Black. And it says outright, the census taker writes outright that he was a slave. And he was born in Louisiana. So we actually find that he's in the household of what looks like a pretty wealthy farmer, a man named H.J. Clayton, or H.I. Clayton, who's worth about $10,000. So we see actually, yeah, enslaved people are employed in agriculture in California as late as 1860. And if you know Sonoma County, right, they're not growing cotton here in 1860. Right, it's probably could be a wheat farm, could be kind of a truck farm, or some other enterprise. This is not plantation agriculture in Sonoma County in 1860. This is actually a much more interesting one. These people are not listed as enslaved, but almost certainly they are. So this is from Mendocino Township, which at the time is actually in the boundaries between Mendocino and Sonoma counties changed quite a bit in the 1850s and 1860s. So this was, believe this would now actually be in Mendocino County, but at the time was in Sonoma. And you could see from this, right, that there's this family, William H. Toombs family. All of them are from the South. He's from Virginia. His wife is from Kentucky. Some of their children are born, actually, it looks like most of their children are born in Missouri, as well as what appears to be perhaps an entire family of enslaved people, a mother and several of her children. Now, they are not listed as slaves, but there are telltale signs that they are probably enslaved. The first is, right, they're living with this white family. This is a single household, right? That's one entry here. They're living with this white family. They are all born in the same state, and at the same state as the white daughter of this family, and they have no last names. They don't have any last names. So this is very likely an enslaved family brought from Missouri, most likely, working on this Sonoma County farm in 1860. So again, this is just to go to show us that we find African-American slavery in places we don't expect to see, in industries we don't expect to see, even in Sonoma County, and actually pretty large numbers for a county with a fairly low population, as Sonoma did have in the 1850s and 60s, and also pretty high number for a state that's allegedly abolished slavery. So for the rest of my time, and I don't have too much time left, I just want to sort of talk about actually the combined issues of how we might kind of rethink the freedom slavery binary and the black-white binary. And I think that it's best to kind of talk about these two things hand in hand because they go together. So obviously that story I told at the beginning about Shasta reveals, right, that not only African Americans, people of African descent, suffered enslavement in California. Actually, Native people did too. And also that slavery wasn't the only what I would call unfree or coercive or forced labor system. And in fact, the California Gold Rush is very much built on types of labor that, really kind of occupy this gray area between slavery and freedom and involve people who don't fit easily into categories of just black or white. So I'm just going to give you a quick preview of some of those, and then I'm going to talk more specifically about Native American servitude and give you a Sonoma County example. So just to give you a flavor for what I'm talking about when I say there are lots of unfree laborers in Gold Rush, California, there are a fair number of Chileans and Mexicans who are working as peons or peones in the California Gold Rush. So they're coming from Chile mostly, if they're in Latin America or in South America, or from Mexico. They are going into debt to have their passage paid to California. And as part of what they're supposed to be doing, they're going to pay off their passage by working in the mines. And so very common in the earliest years of the gold rush to find Chilean and Mexican miners working in California's gold country. And in fact, Mexican miners in particular, who many of them had already been working in mining before coming to California, developed some really important gold mining techniques. You probably are somewhat familiar with the history of Chinese immigrants in California. There seems to be this big misunderstanding that Chinese immigrants who came to California were all enslaved. And we can talk about that in the Q&A, but that is not true. In fact, many, not all, but many Chinese men, especially those who came to work in the gold rush, came to California by a system that looked actually kind of similar to a lot of East Coast white Americans, which is that they borrowed money from wealthy merchants in their home countries to buy their tickets to the United States, and then they paid those merchants back, oftentimes with heavy interest, with the money that they gained in California. But so they're not entirely free because they're working under essentially kind of a system of debt bondage that's similar to peonage, but definitely not chattel slavery. And just to give you another flavor of this, this is a wonderful contract where Jacob Lease, who's actually, I believe, a ranchero from Sonoma County, hired a group of Chinese miners or Chinese laborers, they weren't miners, to work on his rancho. And he actually contracted them in Hong Kong to come in 1849. And you see that they've signed a very specific contract about how much they're going to be paid and how much work that they have to do in exchange for their passage to the United States. In a related topic to Native American enslavement that I'm going to talk about in a second, we also see systems of sex trafficking in California. I'm not going to go into this a lot today. You can ask me about it in the Q&A. But we see markets for sexual labor. Women and children, especially Native American children and Chinese immigrant women, held in conditions of debt bondage, enslavement, captivity, and then forced into sex work, essentially, as part of this early California economy that is mostly aimed at a single a large population of single men. So I'm going to end today just by talking a little bit about one of these labor systems, and that is forced Native American labor. So obviously we already know from the Shasta story at the very beginning that California had this system, actually a legal system, by which white people and Mexicans who were considered to be white under the law in the early 1850s and into the 1860s, could take Native children if they were orphans or if their parents consented to the relationship, to take Native children and bind them into their households essentially as wards. So 1850 said, hey, this 1850 law said, hey, if you have a Native child and you want them to work for you until they become adults, then here's a system by which you can do that. Now, in some cases, maybe like the Shasta case, there's a legit, she's legitimately an orphan, and maybe Wozencraft is taking her in and all of this. We don't quite know what was going on with her and whether her parents actually had abandoned her. If they abandoned her, it was under huge duress, obviously, because they were being chased by a military force that was accompanying Wozencraft. But so, she was allegedly an orphan being incorporated into this household, but a lot of times it's actually much more common for white and Mexican householders to take Native children from their parents and incorporate them into their households. And again, the parents were supposed to consent to this, but it's pretty clear that there were lots of legal shenanigans. And you can imagine that these laws would be open to abuse, especially with Native families and Native children who are very vulnerable to coercion, manipulation, being kind of taken before a court, and they don't precisely know how to represent their rights in these courts that are where the law is just stacked against them. So this is the 1850 law. I talked about this a little bit already, just to kind of give you a sense of what that looks like on the books. Again, expanded in 1860 to make this process even more widespread. More white householders after 1860 could take Native children into their homes and hold them as servants for a long time. And it really loosened up the 1850 requirement that the child's family or parents or current guardians had to give consent. That was pretty much done away with in 1860. Right? So the law is very susceptible to manipulation. Oh, these are just some great, they're heartbreaking photographs of some Native children who are working in homes as bound, apprenticed, enslaved servants. These are not from Sonoma County, but they give us just kind of an amazing photographic record of what this actually looked like on the ground. These photographs, if you know anything about the history of slavery in the United States, these photographs look very similar to those of enslaved women, nurses, essentially, who have, or nursemaids, who have white children in their care. So there's lots of pictures from the American South where enslaved Black women are holding free white children, right? The children of their masters, in these kinds of photographs meant to emphasize the family relationship here and try to make it appear like, oh, this is just a family relationship, not coercive, right? So these are things that these families took to kind of emphasize that they're incorporating these children into their households and trying to, I think, kind of downplay the coercion that is implicit in these relationships. And just to give you a quick Sonoma County example of kind of how the law works and the kind of legal maneuvering shenanigans that folks can engage in order to get a hold of these children. I'll just tell you about the figure that you're probably already pretty familiar with. So again, if you know your Sonoma County history, I'm sure that you know Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo. the essentially kind of the largest ranchero in Sonoma County, owned most of Sonoma County as a Mexican land grant, and eventually lost most of his land over the course of the early US era. But in 1852, here we find in a series of court records that are now housed at the California State Archives, we find Vallejo petitioning the Anglo, or white American justice of the peace, a man named Peter Campbell, I don't really know that much about, to have a child placed with him. And this is essentially under the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, a little girl named Timotea, who was about 10 years old. And basically, she was going to be bound into Vallejo's household until she came of age, which would have been, I believe, the age of 15, and that in exchange for working for him, essentially as a household servant, he was going to feed her and clothe her and do everything kind of necessary to support her. Now, you may notice, if you can read the handwriting, that Peter Campbell does not require the mother of Timotea to actually come and be present at this. He basically says, like, there was a prior agreement here. And so he doesn't require that the parents be involved directly in the process. And in fact, this indenture, you can probably see here, is signed by Timotea, the 10-year-old girl, and not one of her parents. And you can see it has her name here written by probably Campbell himself with her mark, meaning she's illiterate, so she's just putting an X there. So we're already seeing kind of the legal manipulation that can happen here. Did her mother actually consent to this? And then what's very interesting is we wonder how consensual this actually was, because very soon after, in the same set of legal records, we find that Timotea has escaped from Vallejo's home and gone to live with one of his Anglo neighbors. And Vallejo has to actually go to Peter Campbell and force this guy named Nicholas Kerrigan to give her up. So we don't know why she ran away. Maybe she wasn't being fed. Maybe she wasn't being clothed. Maybe she suffered some abuse. Maybe she just didn't want to be there. And Vallejo was able to use the law to compel her to come back and to essentially force her back into his household after she has tried to run away for whatever reason. Okay, so we're seeing that this process is unfolding among even some of the most important, wealthy members of Sonoma County society. So I'm just about to end. I want to just say briefly, one of the very last things I think that learning about this history can do is kind of, again, unsettle our idea that slavery was abolished in 1865 and emancipation happened, right? That's the narrative of slavery in the United States, is that the Civil War ended slavery. It ended in 1865, put into process by Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation a couple years earlier. But what we learn, again, is when we look at the case of California, things look a little bit different. California did, in fact, also get rid of its Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, the part that allowed apprenticeship, in 1863, because of the kinds of abuses that we see in the Vallejo case, actually much worse abuses that happened after 1860. So the California legislature, at around the same time as the Emancipation Proclamation, and I don't think that that's a coincidence, gets rid of this Apprenticeship Act. At the same time, there are no provisions made for Native children who are, or adults, but especially Native children who are already bound into households under the original law. Right? There's nothing that says that those people have to be freed. And we also know that informal coercion not having anywhere to go, not knowing anybody else, basically being kind of tucked away in one of these white households might mean long-term enslavement for some Native people. Again, we have the example of Shasta, who stayed with the Wozencraft family at least until the early 1880s. She spent almost all of her natural life with them. And it kind of makes us think about where the real endpoint of slavery is. And I think that looking west can complicate that and make us think a lot more broadly about the history of slavery and emancipation. So I'm going to stop there. I know I went over a little bit, and I welcome any questions that you might have.
Well, thank you
Maybe I'll put
so
this back up,
much, Stacey. Can
or
you
maybe
hear
I'll
me?
stop sharing. There we go.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, I just wanted to make
Okay, I
sure.
have my own little timesheet here. Well, thank you so much. I have to say, I wanted to monitor the time, and the next time I looked, it was 40 minutes in. So, okay. So everyone who, it was amazing. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
For everyone, if you joined later and missed the introduction, we are taking questions through the chat today. So please, if you have any questions, just submit them through the chat, and I'm going to, don't see it. Ooh, where is it? Where did my chat go?
When's my next book coming out?
So the first, let me see. My chat disappeared.
Oh, is it not coming up for you?
Joanna?
Oh, I'm getting these sent as direct messages to me.
Okay, so, okay,
Perhaps.
let's see. Okay, I got it. So I don't see any. Do you have any direct messages to yourself?
I do. One of the first question is, when is your next book coming out?
Okay.
That is an evil question to ask a professor. Hopefully sooner rather than later. But it has been COVID has really disrupted things. I was telling Simone that I would really love to come to the library and work there in the what sounds like an amazing collection, and I just haven't had a chance because of COVID. So I really I'm looking forward to that. I hope maybe like 3 years, but I'm working on a study of actually free African Americans who were abolitionists and anti-slavery activists in California. So kind of the flip side in some ways, the people who are trying to help enslaved people get their freedom.
Mm-hmm. Okay, do you see any other questions on your end?
I don't.
Okay. Okay, here we go.
Oh, okay. Yes, familiar. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a question here. Do you know about the enslavement attempts on Lucy Young from Mendocino County? Her story is in a book called No Rooms of Their Own.
Yes, absolutely. And so so Lucy Young, just for folks who are not familiar, Lucy Young was a woman who was a Native woman, I want to say Wailaki Wintu woman, who was enslaved in Mendocino County. She was stolen away from her family as a child a couple of times and managed to make it back to her village, and then later in life had a series of marriages to white men, and it wasn't really clear how free they were, and in fact, I mean, one of them was enslavement, I would say, or she was forcibly impregnated, beaten until she lost her child, chained to a piece of furniture, and she managed to eventually escape and kind of make it out of enslavement, and eventually married a man from a related band, and bought her own farm, and so really kind of survived this onslaught of enslavement in Mendocino County. And yes, absolutely, there's a book, I think it's called with, I think, no rooms of their own is what the,
Mhm.
yes,
And yes.
and the narrative is in there. I don't remember the editor's name, but I've used that source for sure.
Okay. Any other questions here?
So I have one in mind that says, am I familiar with Biddy Mason? Absolutely. So Biddy Mason, again, for folks who don't know, is a really important figure in the early history of California. She was an enslaved woman from Mississippi originally, but her master was a member of the LDS Church and brought her and a large group of enslaved people to Salt Lake City. And then they moved, like a very large group, again, about 25 people moved to San Bernardino in the early 1850s. And she became, and another enslaved woman became kind of the center of a really famous case to become free and get their children free in 1856. And then she went on to be kind of a founding member of the Black community in Los Angeles. And there's actually going to be a Biddy Mason monument that's in planning. There's a lot of work on Biddy Mason right now, a lot of excitement about studying Biddy Mason's story.
I have another question here from John. You focused a lot on the legal system in California. Can you tell us what impact, if any, the California Colored Conventions had on the California legal system as lobbyists?
Well, unfortunately, throughout the 1850s, they did not have much success. And so I mentioned these briefly. The California Colored Citizens Conventions are conventions where basically Black residents from all over the state get together, usually meet in one of the churches in Sacramento or San Francisco, and they discuss pieces of legislation that are hurting the Black community. And specifically, the one that they were very focused on in the 1850s was California had a law that prohibited Black Americans and Native Americans and later Chinese immigrants from testifying against whites in court or in any case involving a white person. And so their goal in the 1850s was really to get that repealed. And time again, they petitioned to have that happen. And the state legislature considered it, but wouldn't really, a lot of times wouldn't even give them the time of day. And in one particular case in the early 1850s, the clerk of the California Assembly was instructed to throw their petition out the window into the street. Right, this is the level of hostility that the California legislature had for Black people, is that just this petition saying, hey, we want to be able to testify in court. They say, throw it out the window into the street, and we don't want to accept any more petitions on this subject. So I'd actually say not so successful in the 1850s in terms of lobbyists. It's really not until the Republican Party comes into power in California that they get traction with their petitioning. And then it is more successful in the 1860s, and they get that repealed.
Thank you. So I opened the chat to everyone, and you'll probably see that the editor of the book, here's an addendum. The editor of the book Rooms of Their Own is Ida Ray Egley.
Yeah.
Check out the same book. There's an essay about Charlotte Brown, the first person to challenge the law about riding conveyances in California.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, that's great.
Okay, I think we can take one more question from Donna here. Has DNA testing uncovered any direct descendants of unfree California laborers?
Oh, I'm not sure about I don't know of any DNA testing, but certainly oral histories and family histories and the kind of genealogical research that folks do at the Sonoma Library there has uncovered descendants. And I will say that one of the most important stories that I know about right now is if you're following at all the reparations task force, reparations for slavery in California task force, they have been hearing from families who the California state park system took their land in the 1930s or 40s to make the Gold Discovery Park in Coloma, California. And those people who had their land taken away were actually descendants of some of the first enslaved African Americans who arrived in the gold country. The Burgess, Bell, and Gooch families, which some of you may have heard of, who were kind of in and around Coloma where gold was discovered. Their families own some of that land that is now the Gold Discovery, the Marshall Gold Discovery Park, and it was taken from them under eminent domain. They didn't get market value for it, and now there's really a push and a lot of family research and genealogy to kind of prove those connections and to push for reparations for that stolen land.
Okay, thank you. I see another message here. Thank you very much for this lecture, Yegli. Wonderfully interesting. I think we can all agree to that. Thank you so much. If you liked this webinar, you might also be interested in our next virtual talk coming up on December 8th. Art historian Celia Starr will discuss Frida Kahlo's creative and personal journey while living in the United States. And I've heard that a visit to Luther Burbank's home and garden inspired a breakthrough style of painting there. So that sounds very interesting. You can already register for this event. It's up on our library website. Just go to programs and events and click on the date, and you can register right now if you'd like to. And thanks again, Professor Smith. Thanks again, everyone attending, and see you next time. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.